I found out my parents called me a freeloader after I paid for their life, so I cut them off. Hey, I'm Alex, and let me tell you, growing up with a golden child sibling is like living in someone else's spotlight all the time. You know the type. There's always that one kid in the family who can do no wrong. For me, that kid was my older brother, Eric. The guy was practically a superhero in my parents' eyes. Star athlete, straight A student, Mr. Popular. You name it, he had it going on. It was always about him. From the time I was little, it was clear who the favorite was. Our house was the place for family get-togethers, and trust me, these weren't small, intimate dinners. Nah, we're talking about big events. Like half the neighborhood showing up, uncles, aunts, cousins, people I barely knew. And somehow these gatherings always turned into Eric appreciation parties. Dad would be flipping burgers on the grill, Mom would be running around making sure everyone had enough food, and there'd be Eric, holding court like a king, with people just hanging on his every word. It's not like I didn't try to fit in, you know? I wanted to be part of it, but somehow it just never worked out. I'd crack a joke and it'd fall flat, or I'd mention something about school, and it was like no one even heard me. I remember one time, this is just a random memory, but it sticks with me. I was about 10, and I got a perfect score on this science test. I was super proud of it. So during one of these family barbecues, I went up to my dad, all excited to show him. But just as I was about to say something, my mom comes running out with this huge cake, and everyone's celebrating Eric winning some soccer tournament. So yeah, my little science test? Totally forgotten. That was basically my life in a nutshell. I wasn't a bad kid or anything. In fact, I did pretty well in school. I wasn't out partying or causing trouble, but you wouldn't know it from how little attention I got. Meanwhile, Eric was the family's pride and joy. He had his own shelf for all his trophies and medals, and Mom even made a scrapbook for him, with every single achievement carefully glued in. I didn't have a scrapbook. I didn't even have a shelf. Hell, I'm pretty sure half my stuff was crammed into a box in the attic somewhere, collecting dust. The thing that really got me, though, wasn't even the lack of attention. It was the way people acted like Eric was some kind of god. Like, no joke, at every single family event, someone would bring him up even if he wasn't there. It's like, oh, did you hear about Eric? He's playing varsity now. Or Eric's got such a bright future ahead of him, I just know he's going to be successful. And I'd be sitting there like, hi? I exist too. The worst part? I started believing it. Like, maybe there really was something wrong with me. Maybe I wasn't worth the attention. I'd sit in my room sometimes just thinking about why I wasn't good enough, even though I was doing everything right. I wasn't failing school. I wasn't getting into trouble. So why wasn't I seen? There was only one person who seemed to get me. Great Aunt Sharon. She wasn't actually all that great in the big important family sense, but to me, she was awesome. Every time there was a family gathering, she'd always take a moment to sit with me. While everyone else was fawning over Eric or caught up in the latest family gossip, she'd pull up a chair and ask me about what I was reading or how school was going. And unlike everyone else, she actually cared about the answer. I remember one time I was hiding in the backyard during one of the big parties. I wasn't feeling it that day and just wanted to escape the noise, so I found a quiet spot behind the garage with a book. Aunt Sharon found me there, sitting cross-legged in the dirt, and instead of dragging me back into the crowd, she sat down beside me. "What are you reading, kiddo?" she asked, her voice calm, like she didn't have anywhere else she'd rather be. I showed her the cover, some fantasy book I'd borrowed from the library. "It's about this kid who finds out he's got these magic powers," I mumbled, half expecting her to lose interest. But she didn't. "Sounds exciting," she said, giving me that warm smile she always had. "You've got a good imagination, Alex. Don't ever let anyone tell you different." That stuck with me. It was the first time in a long while I felt like someone noticed me for who I was, not just Eric's little brother. Aunt Sharon didn't care about soccer trophies or school grades. She just cared about me being me. And honestly, in a family like mine, that meant the world. Still, as much as I loved those quiet moments with Aunt Sharon, they didn't really make up for everything else. Every day felt like a reminder that I wasn't Eric. Like when I started high school, I figured it'd be a fresh start, you know? New teachers, new opportunities. But nope, everyone knew me as Eric's brother. It didn't matter what I did or how well I did it. Every teacher, every coach, every classmate would say the same thing. "Oh, you're Eric's brother. He was such a great student, a great athlete." Even when I made top grades, nobody seemed to care. One time I got an A+ on this massive project in history class. I was pumped. I went home and tried to tell my mom, but she was too busy on the phone with some other soccer mom talking about Eric's latest game. I stood there for a while, waiting for her to hang up, but after like 10 minutes, I just gave up and went to my room. That project got stuffed into my drawer, forgotten like everything else I'd done. The funny thing is, I didn't even want to be Eric. I didn't care about sports or being the most popular guy in school. I just wanted some recognition, you know? Just a little bit of that same pride my parents had for him. But it never came. And the thing is, after a while, you stop expecting it. You start to convince yourself that it's normal, that being overlooked is just how things are supposed to be. That's how I lived my whole childhood, constantly overshadowed, constantly trying to prove I was worth something. It wasn't until years later that I finally realized I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. But back then, I was just a kid, waiting for someone to notice I was there. So high school started, and I had this tiny bit of hope that things would be different. You know, new environment, new people, maybe a chance to finally be seen as my own person instead of just Eric's younger brother. But of course, reality hit pretty quick. It wasn't even the first day when people started connecting the dots. Oh, you're Eric's brother, right? He was like amazing on the soccer team. Yeah, your brother was such a good student. You must be just like him. That last comment really got to me because I wasn't like him, not at all. But people just couldn't help making those comparisons. It was like I was walking around in this shadow that was glued to me no matter where I went. Every single teacher, every single coach, they all had this weird expectation that I'd be just like Eric, like I was supposed to carry on his legacy or something. But that wasn't who I was. I wasn't some sports star, and I definitely wasn't the life of the party. I was the kid who sat in the back of the classroom, taking notes and actually paying attention. I worked hard, studied late, and asked questions after class when I didn't get something. It was important to me that I understood things, not because I was trying to impress anyone, but because I actually cared. And I'm not trying to brag or anything, but I was doing well, better than anyone expected. There was one time, I remember it clearly during my junior year. I was in biology, and we had this massive project that everyone was stressing out over. The teacher, Mrs. Baker, told us it was going to count for like 40% of our grade for the semester. People were freaking out, and I get it. Biology wasn't exactly everyone's favorite subject, but I actually liked it. I dove into that project like my life depended on it, researching everything I could about cell division and how it affects the body. I spent days in the library, poring over books and articles, and I'm pretty sure I was the only one who actually read the assigned chapters. By the time the project was due, I felt pretty confident. Mrs. Baker called me up after class one day, holding my project in her hand, and I'll never forget what she said. She smiled at me, actually smiled, and said, "Alex, this is excellent work. You really went above and beyond." That little moment meant the world to me. It was probably the first time a teacher had acknowledged me like I wasn't just some kid in the background. I felt proud walking home that day. But of course, when I told my parents about it, they barely reacted. I remember coming home and sitting at the kitchen table with my mom. She was on the phone, as usual, chatting with one of her friends about Eric's latest game. I waited for her to hang up, holding my project in my hands like it was a trophy. When she finally put the phone down, I showed her the grade and told her what Mrs. Baker had said. "Oh, that's nice, honey," she said without even looking at it. Then she went right back to talking about how Eric was getting scouted by some college coach. I just sat there staring at the A+ on my project, feeling like I'd been hit with this invisible wall. No matter what I did, no matter how hard I worked, it never seemed to matter to them. It was always Eric this, Eric that. That kind of stuff happened all the time. Like, there was this other time in history class where we had to write a paper on World War II. I spent hours researching and writing, making sure everything was perfect. I was so proud of how it turned out. The teacher, Mr. Davis, even read part of my paper out loud in class because he thought it was one of the best ones. But when I got home and tried to tell my dad, he just shrugged and said something like, "That's cool, but have you seen Eric's new soccer trophy?" It wasn't just my parents, though. It felt like the whole world was fixated on Eric. Whenever we had family dinners or gatherings, all anyone wanted to talk about was how great he was doing. My grandparents would sit there for hours asking him questions about his games, his future plans, and his scholarships. And when the conversation finally died down, it would shift to something else, like the weather or politics. No one ever asked me about school or how I was doing. At some point, I just stopped trying. I mean, why bother? It was clear that nothing I did would ever compare to Eric's accomplishments in their eyes. I'd come home from school, head straight to my room, and bury myself in my homework or a book. It wasn't like I had much of a social life anyway. While Eric was out with his friends, going to parties or playing in games, I was at home, studying and trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. The funny thing is, even though I didn't get much attention at home, I was actually thriving at school. I joined a few clubs, made friends with people who shared the same interests as me, and even started getting recognized by my teachers as one of the top students in my grade. I wasn't some social butterfly, but I found my group. the kids who like to stay after class and talk about books, science, and movies. It was nice to have people who didn't expect me to be anyone other than myself. But even with all that, there was still this lingering feeling that I wasn't good enough. Like, no matter what I achieved, it would never be enough to get the recognition I wanted from my parents. I mean, it's not like I was craving the spotlight or anything, but a little acknowledgement would have been nice. Just once, I wanted to hear them say they were proud of me for something I'd done, not because I was Eric's sibling, but because I was me. I guess the turning point came during senior year, when I was applying to colleges. I'd worked my butt off for years, getting good grades, participating in clubs, and trying to build a solid application. I applied to a few schools, and one day I got the letter, acceptance into a business program at State University. I was thrilled. I ran home, excited to tell my parents the good news, but when I walked in the door and announced that I'd been accepted, their reaction was underwhelming, to say the least. "Oh, that's nice, Alex," my mom said, barely looking up from her magazine. "Cool," my dad muttered, scrolling through his phone. "What about Eric? Did he get in anywhere?" That was it. That was the moment I realized that no matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried, they were never going to see me the way I wanted them to. I wasn't Eric, and that meant I didn't matter as much in their eyes. It hurt, but it also lit a fire in me. If they weren't going to believe in me, I was going to prove them wrong, one way or another. So, after that whole thing with getting into State University, I pretty much accepted that my parents weren't ever going to care about my accomplishments the way they did with Eric. I tried not to dwell on it too much, but it still stung. I mean, it's hard not to feel it when you're working your butt off and the people who are supposed to care the most barely even notice. Anyway, I'd been accepted into the business program, which was a big deal for me. I was pumped, but the reality of paying for it was creeping up fast. With no help from my parents, I was basically on my own. I'd been applying for scholarships, grants, and anything else that could help cover the costs, but it wasn't enough. That's when Aunt Sharon stepped in. I wasn't expecting it at all. One afternoon, I was hanging out at her place, helping her with some stuff around the house. Aunt Sharon lived in this cozy little house that always smelled like fresh bread or cookies, way better than the chaos at my parents' house. We were sitting in her kitchen, and out of nowhere, she asked me how things were going with college. I tried to shrug it off, like I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. "Yeah, I got accepted, but I'm not sure how I'm going to pay for it. It's kind of up in the air right now." Aunt Sharon put down the dish she was washing and turned to look at me. "Alex, I know your parents haven't been much help, but you're smart, and you've worked hard to get where you are. You shouldn't have to give up on your dreams because of money." I didn't say anything at first. I mean, what could I say? She wasn't wrong, but I had already resigned myself to the fact that I might have to delay college or work full-time just to save up. It was just one of those things I thought I'd have to deal with. Then Aunt Sharon said something that completely floored me. "I've got some savings," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I've been putting money away for years, and I'd like to give it to you for your tuition." I just stared at her for a minute, my brain trying to catch up with what she was saying. "Wait, what? You want to help me pay for school?" I couldn't believe it. No one had ever offered to help me like that before. She smiled and nodded. "I don't have any kids of my own, and I've always seen you as my own. You've got so much potential, Alex. You deserve to go to college and make something of yourself. And I'm not going to let money be the thing that stops you." I swear I almost started crying right there in her kitchen. It was like all the weight I'd been carrying around, the pressure of figuring everything out on my own, just lifted. I didn't even know how to thank her. I just hugged her tight and tried not to lose it. Aunt Sharon's offer changed everything. Suddenly, college wasn't just a distant dream, it was happening. I spent the next few weeks getting everything in order, applying for student housing, signing up for classes, and preparing for this huge new chapter in my life. And the whole time, Aunt Sharon was there, supporting me in ways I didn't even know I needed. But of course, my parents had no idea about any of this. I hadn't told them about Aunt Sharon's offer because, honestly, I didn't think they'd care. They were too busy with Eric's latest achievements to even ask me about my plans. It wasn't until one evening, a couple of weeks before I was set to leave for college, that they finally brought it up. We were sitting around the dinner table, me, my parents, and Eric. The usual chatter about his soccer games and college applications was in full swing when my mom suddenly turned to me. "So, Alex, what are you planning to do after graduation?" she asked, like it was the first time she'd thought about it. I almost laughed. "I'm going to college," I said, trying to keep my tone casual. "I got accepted into the business program at State University." For a split second, the room went quiet. My dad put down his fork and raised an eyebrow. And how exactly are you planning on paying for that? This was it. The moment I'd been dreading. I took a deep breath. Aunt Sharon is helping me. She's giving me her savings for my tuition. My parents' reactions were exactly what I expected. My mom's eyes went wide with shock, and my dad's face twisted into this weird combination of surprise and anger. Sharon's giving you money? My dad said, his voice sharp. That's ridiculous. If she has money to spare, it should go to Eric. He needs a new car for college. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They didn't even care that I was finally getting my shot at something. They were more concerned about Eric needing a car. I felt this wave of frustration rise up in me, but I tried to stay calm. This isn't about Eric, I said, my voice tight. Aunt Sharon wants to help me. She offered, and I'm not turning it down. Mom, of course, tried to guilt-trip me. But your brother needs that money, Alex. You know how important his future is. I couldn't take it anymore. I'm important too, I snapped, louder than I intended. This is my future we're talking about. I've worked hard for this, and Aunt Sharon believes in me. Why can't you guys? The silence that followed was deafening. My parents just stared at me, completely caught off guard by my outburst. Eric, for once, didn't say anything. He just sat there, looking uncomfortable. I didn't care, though. I'd had enough of being ignored, enough of being the second thought. I'm going to college, I repeated, quieter this time, but just as firm. With or without your support. I pushed my chair back and left the table. I didn't need their approval anymore. For the first time in my life, I had someone in my corner who believed in me, Aunt Sharon. And that was enough. The next few weeks were a blur. I packed up my things, said goodbye to the few friends I had in town, and got ready for the big move. I still hadn't told my parents much about my plans, and honestly, I didn't feel like I owed them any explanations. This was my time to finally step out of Eric's shadow and make something of myself. When the day came to leave, Aunt Sharon drove me to campus. As we pulled up to the dorms, I felt this overwhelming mix of nerves and excitement. It was the start of something completely new, and I couldn't wait to see where it would take me. As I hugged Aunt Sharon goodbye, I couldn't help but feel grateful. She'd given me the chance I needed, and I wasn't going to waste it. Starting college felt like stepping into a whole new world. I'd never really been away from home for that long, and now I was suddenly surrounded by people my age, all living on their own for the first time. It was exciting, but at the same time, a little overwhelming. When Aunt Sharon dropped me off, I remember standing outside my dorm building, looking at the huge campus in front of me, feeling like I'd finally made it. The first week was a blur of orientations, meeting new people, and trying to get the hang of things. I wasn't exactly the most outgoing person, so I was a bit nervous about making friends. But surprisingly, it wasn't as hard as I thought. Everyone was in the same boat, new place, new faces, so it was easy to strike up conversations in the dining hall or between classes. My roommate Jake was one of those super chill guys who somehow managed to be friends with everyone. He had this laid-back vibe and always seemed to know what was going on around campus. I didn't know it at the time, but having him as a roommate would end up being one of the best things that happened to me during those early days. He was the type of person who would introduce me to everyone, and before I knew it, I had a solid group of friends. But as much as the social part of college was important, I was still there to get a degree. I was determined not to let anything distract me from that. I didn't come all this way just to slack off. The first day of classes, I showed up early, sat in the front row, and took notes like my life depended on it. The professors were intimidating at first, way different from high school teachers, but they seemed to appreciate the effort I was putting in. There was one professor, Dr. Collins, who taught my intro to business class. He was this older guy with a thick beard and a voice that could command an entire lecture hall without a microphone. I remember the first time I raised my hand to ask a question, my heart was pounding. But instead of brushing me off or giving a short answer, Dr. Collins smiled and said, "Good question, Alex," and then went on to explain it in detail. That one small moment was a big deal to me. It felt like validation, like I wasn't just another face in the crowd. That class quickly became my favorite. It wasn't just the subject. I mean, business was what I came here to study. But it was the way Dr. Collins made everything click. He had this way of turning what seemed like complicated concepts into something I could actually wrap my head around. I'd go back to my dorm every day and reread my notes, making sure I understood everything. Jake thought I was a little too intense about it sometimes, but honestly, I didn't care. This was my shot, and I wasn't going to waste it. Speaking of Jake, I have to give the guy credit. He was one of those people who could breeze through classes without really trying, but he never made me feel bad for taking things seriously. He'd joke around about how I was teacher's pet, but it was all in good fun. And when he saw me stressing out about an assignment or a test, he'd actually sit down with me and help me relax a bit. Dude, it's college, he'd say, tossing a ball of crumpled up paper at me from across the room. You're supposed to have fun. Don't burn yourself out before midterms. He had a point, but I couldn't help it. There was a lot riding on this for me. This wasn't just about getting a degree. It was about proving to myself that I was more than just the forgotten sibling. Every time I sat down to study or work on a project, it felt like I was pushing back against all the years of being overlooked. I wasn't doing it for my parents or even for Aunt Sharon. I was doing it for me. Still, I did try to loosen up a bit. Jake dragged me out to a few campus events. Nothing too crazy, just stuff like movie nights or hanging out with some people from the dorm. I'll admit, it was nice to step away from the books for a bit and actually enjoy being at college. I started feeling like I belonged there, like I was part of something bigger than just my little world of lectures and textbooks. One of the biggest surprises, though, came from a class project. Dr. Collins had assigned us a group project where we had to come up with a business idea and present it to the class. Group projects weren't really my thing. I'd always been the kid who ended up doing all the work while everyone else slacked off. But this time it was different. My group was made up of 3 other students, Jess, Tyler, and Marcus. Jess was super organized, Tyler was this tech genius, and Marcus had a way with words that made him perfect for presentations. For once, I wasn't the only one pulling my weight. We worked really well together, bouncing ideas off each other and actually listening to each other's input. By the time we presented our idea, a campus delivery service for late-night snacks, we were all feeling pretty confident. The day of the presentation, I was nervous as hell. Public speaking wasn't my strong suit, but I'd practiced my part over and over until I could recite it in my sleep. When we got up there, though, everything clicked. Jess nailed the intro, Tyler's tech demo worked perfectly, and Marcus wrapped it all up with this killer closing statement. I did my part without stumbling, and when we finished, the class actually clapped. Dr. Collins gave us a nod of approval, and I swear, it felt like winning the lottery. That project ended up being a turning point for me. Not only did we get an A, but it also made me realize that I was capable of more than I thought. I wasn't just the quiet kid in the background anymore. I was part of a team, and I'd contributed something meaningful. It was a huge confidence boost, and it pushed me to keep going, to keep pushing myself out of my comfort zone. By the end of that first semester, I felt like I was finally hitting my stride. I wasn't just surviving college, I was thriving. Sure, there were still moments where I doubted myself, and yeah, I missed Aunt Sharon and the comfort of her house sometimes, but I was building something here, something that was mine. I guess what I'm trying to say is, college was more than just classes and grades for me. It was the first time I felt like I had control over my life, like I was the one deciding who I was going to be. And even though there were still challenges ahead, I knew I could handle it. For the first time in a long time, I was excited about the future. So, after college, I did what any recent graduate does. I found a job. It wasn't anything flashy, but it was steady, and I was grateful for it. It gave me the chance to save up and figure out what I wanted to do next. I knew from the start that working for someone else wasn't going to cut it for me long term. I had bigger plans. That's when the idea of opening my own restaurant started brewing in my head. I've always loved cooking, and the idea of running my own place just felt right. I kept thinking about what it would be like to have my own spot, where people would come in for good food and a welcoming atmosphere. After a couple of years of working and saving, I finally took the leap. I opened my first restaurant in a small but busy part of town. It wasn't anything fancy at first, just a cozy little place with a simple menu. But people started coming, and before I knew it, the business was taking off. Running a restaurant isn't easy, though. Those first few months were insane. I barely had time to breathe between managing the kitchen, serving customers, and handling all the behind-the-scenes stuff. But despite the long hours and stress, I loved it. It felt like I was finally doing something that was mine, something I built from the ground up. And when it started getting popular, that was just the icing on the cake. As the restaurant grew, I took the next big step, opening another branch. It felt like a dream. I never imagined I'd have more than one place, but there I was, expanding the business and watching it thrive. Eventually, I had a few locations around town, and things were going better than I could have hoped for. I had a solid team of employees, and the restaurants were making a good profit. Life was pretty good. And then, as if on cue, my parents came back into the picture. It started with a phone call from my mom. I hadn't heard much from her or my dad in a while, not since I'd gone off to college. We'd been keeping our distance, which honestly was fine by me. But suddenly there they were, back again, asking for a favor. Alex, sweetie, how are you doing? It's been so long, Mom said, her voice all sweet and full of fake enthusiasm. I could tell something was up immediately. I'm fine, Mom. Busy with the restaurants, I replied, keeping it short. I knew there was more to this call than just a friendly check-in. Well, we're so proud of you. You know that, right? She said, her voice edging toward what I could only describe as desperation. But, um, we were wondering if you could do us a little favor? It's about Eric. Of course, it was about Eric. It's always about Eric. I let her continue, even though I already had a good idea of where this was going. You know, he's been struggling to find work lately. He's applied everywhere, but no one's hiring him, she explained. He's had some issues at his last few jobs, and now it's like no one will give him a chance. We were hoping maybe you could help him out. Give him a job at one of your restaurants? I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. Eric, the golden child who could do no wrong, had apparently messed up so many times that even his charm couldn't land him a job anymore. Part of me wanted to say no, to remind them of all the times they put Eric on a pedestal while ignoring everything I did, but I knew that wasn't going to help anyone. So against my better judgment, I agreed. Fine, Mom. I can give him a job, I said, my voice a little more tired than I wanted it to be. But he's going to have to work as a waiter. No special treatment. He needs to actually do the job. Oh, thank you, Alex. You don't know how much this means to us, she gushed, like I'd just saved the world. He'll be so grateful. Grateful? Eric? Yeah, right. When Eric showed up to start work, it was awkward, to say the least. He acted like he was doing me a favor by being there. Like I should be grateful for him gracing my restaurant with his presence. I couldn't believe it. Here I was, giving him a job when no one else would hire him, and he acted like he was above it. But I kept my cool and treated him like any other employee. Surprisingly, he didn't do a terrible job. He wasn't great either, but he showed up, did what was required, and didn't cause too many issues. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than I expected. Things stayed pretty calm for a while after that, but then my parents called again. This time the favor was even bigger. Alex, we need to talk, my dad said, sounding more serious than usual. We're in some financial trouble and we need your help. Of course they were. Apparently they had blown through all their savings. Between Eric's endless adventures, his failed business ideas, the college he never finished, and whatever other nonsense he got into, they had nothing left. They'd spent it all, and now they were looking to me to bail them out. At this point, I should have been used to it. I should have known that they'd come to me eventually, especially after years of pouring everything into Eric. But it still hurt. It still felt like they were only coming to me because they had no other option, not because they actually valued me or cared about what I'd achieved. I could have said no. I could have told them to figure it out on their own, that I wasn't their safety net. But for some reason, I didn't. Maybe part of me still wanted to help, even after everything. Or maybe I just didn't want to see them completely fall apart. So, once again, I agreed. I started sending them a monthly allowance, just enough to help them get by. I wasn't going to cover all of their expenses, but I didn't want them to lose their home, or be out on the street either. It felt like the right thing to do, even though it left a bitter taste in my mouth. And of course, there was Eric still working at the restaurant, still getting by without any real consequences for the messes he'd made. My parents didn't ask him to contribute or to help them out. They just let him keep doing his thing, while I was the one stepping up, as always. In the end, I couldn't help but wonder how things had turned out this way. I'd built something real, something successful, and yet here I was, still cleaning up after the golden child, still giving my parents the help they needed because they'd blown everything on him. But for now, it was what it was. At least I had my restaurants, my business. I'd created something that was mine, and no one could take that away from me. One afternoon, I was at the restaurant going over some invoices and prepping for the upcoming week. It was a normal day, busy, but nothing out of the ordinary. Then my phone rang. It was Aunt Sharon. Now, Aunt Sharon doesn't call me much unless there's something important, so right away I knew something was up. Hey, Aunt Sharon, I said, trying to keep my voice light, even though I was already bracing myself for whatever news she had. Alex, sweetie, you need to see this video, she said, her voice serious. It's from a family party your parents were at last weekend. Someone posted it online and, well, I think you should take a look. My stomach dropped. A video? Of my parents? It didn't sound good. What's it about? I asked, trying to get a sense of what I was walking into. Just watch it. I'm sending you the link right now. Call me after, she said, sounding almost hesitant, like she wasn't sure how I'd react. I opened the link Aunt Sharon sent, and the first thing I saw was my parents, clearly drunk, holding drinks and swaying slightly as they stood in front of a group of people. There was loud music in the background, and the camera was shaky, but I could hear every word they were saying. My mom started talking first. You know, everyone thinks Alex built those restaurants on their own, but really it was all Eric, she slurred, waving her hand dramatically. Eric's the real genius behind it all. He's the one who gave Alex that nice job. He works so hard, running around all day making sure everything's perfect while Alex just sits back and manages things. I blinked, not sure if I'd heard that right. Did she really just say Eric was the one who gave me a job? Eric, who couldn't hold down a job anywhere else, was supposedly the mastermind behind my restaurant business? I was so stunned I almost paused the video, but then my dad chimed in. And you know what else? My dad said, his face flushed and his words slurred. We gave Alex money to start those restaurants. We helped them get off the ground. But does Alex ever thank us? No, ungrateful little freeloader. He practically spat the last word, his face twisting in disgust. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. These were my parents, my own parents, standing there at a family party, drunk out of their minds, telling everyone that I was a freeloader, that I'd only made it because of Eric and their supposed financial help. I felt my blood boiling. The restaurant was mine. I'd built it from scratch. Me, not Eric, not them. They hadn't given me a dime. And now they were standing there, rewriting history like I was some useless leech riding on their coattails. As the video continued, my mom rambled on about how Eric was so humble and didn't take credit for everything he did for me. He could have opened his own business, you know, she said with a slurred giggle. But he's too kind. He just wants to help Alex succeed. That's the kind of brother he is. I felt sick. Eric, who could barely manage to be a waiter, was now apparently the brains behind my entire business, and they were acting like he was some kind of saint for letting me run the restaurants while he quietly did all the real work. It was beyond absurd. It was insulting. It was a flat-out lie. By the time the video ended, my hands were shaking with anger. I couldn't believe they'd do this, talking behind my back, making me look like a joke in front of the whole family, and they didn't even think twice about it, like it was just some casual conversation, like it wasn't a big deal. But it was a big deal. I'd worked my entire life to get to where I was. I'd busted my ass to make something of myself, while Eric had screwed up every opportunity he'd ever had. And now, after everything, they were giving him the credit and calling me the freeloader? I couldn't let this slide. I grabbed my phone and called my parents, my heart pounding as the phone rang. My mom answered, sounding cheerful, like nothing was wrong. Alex, how are you, sweetie? I didn't bother with small talk. I saw the video, I said, my voice cold and shaking with barely contained anger. There was a pause on the other end, and I could practically hear her scrambling to come up with a response. What video? She asked, her voice suddenly wary. The one from the party, I snapped. The one where you and Dad are telling everyone that I'm a freeloader and that Eric is the real reason I've been successful. Oh, that, she said, trying to laugh it off. Alex, you know we were just joking. It was all in good fun. We'd had a few drinks and... You called me a freeloader, I cut her off, my voice rising. You said Eric was the one who gave me a job, that you gave me money to start the restaurants. Do you realize how insulting that is? I built this business on my own without any help from you or Eric, and you're standing there telling people it's all because of him? She started to stammer, but I didn't give her a chance to continue. I've had enough, I said, my voice hard. I'm done with this. I'm done with the lies, the manipulation, all of it. Don't call me. Don't ask me for anything. You're cut off, for good. Alex, wait, we didn't mean... She tried to say, but I hung up before she could finish. I sat there for a minute, my phone still in my hand, trying to process what had just happened. I'd always known my relationship with my parents was messed up, but this? This was the final straw. They had crossed a line that I couldn't forgive. Aunt Sharon called me later that day to check in. I'm so sorry you had to see that, Alex, she said, her voice full of sympathy. I don't know what they were thinking. They weren't, I replied, feeling drained. But it doesn't matter anymore. I'm done with them. After I hung up with Aunt Sharon, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't weighed down by the constant pressure to make my parents happy, to live up to their impossible expectations, or to clean up their messes. I was free. I'd made my own success, and I didn't owe them a thing.
Who do you think you are questioning me like that? The older man barked, his voice sharp and indignant. I didn't flinch, keeping my gaze steady as I replied. Mr. Nguyen, I said, my tone measured. I'm here to help you, but if you want my help, I need the whole picture, every detail. He exhaled sharply, his pride clearly bruised, But he didn't argue further. For a moment he looked away, shaking his head. My name is Danielle, which is the name I chose for myself when I was a kid. I'm a 30-year-old attorney. I never carried my family last name. I created my own. I built my career on resilience, channeling the pain of my past into a drive to succeed. When I was 6 years old, my parents abandoned me at an orphanage, leaving me to piece together a life without them. They walked away without a second glance, leaving me to wonder what I had done wrong, why I wasn't enough. Now, decades later, the very people who discarded me are sitting in my office, begging for legal counsel, and they have no idea who I am. I was 6 years old the last time I saw them. My mom had dressed me in my nicest outfit that morning, a yellow dress with little white daisies, and told me we were going somewhere special. I remember holding her hand tightly as we walked into the orphanage, the bright sunlight outside contrasting with the dimly lit hallways inside. The air smelled of cleaning supplies and something else I couldn't place, something cold, like emptiness. She knelt down in front of me, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "You'll love it here," she said, her voice soft but hollow. "They'll take such good care of you." I didn't understand what she meant. "When are you coming back?" I asked, my small hands clutching hers. She hesitated, her eyes darting away before she forced a smile. "Soon, sweetheart. Be good, okay?" I didn't cry as she walked away. I just stood there, staring at the door, waiting for it to swing open again. But it didn't. Hours passed, and then days, before I realized she wasn't coming back. That was the day I learned what it meant to be alone. The orphanage became my world, a place where I quickly learned that survival meant toughness. I stopped asking why my parents didn't come back. The other kids didn't want to hear it, and the caretakers didn't have answers. Instead, I focused on what I could control, my studies. Books became my escape, a place where I could lose myself in stories far from the sterile walls of the orphanage. I promised myself I'd be better, smarter, stronger than anyone who thought I wasn't worth keeping. But the nights were the hardest. Alone in my bunk, I'd stare at the ceiling, wondering what I had done to make them leave me. Did I cry too much? Was I not helpful enough? Every question became a fuel for the fire inside me, a fire that burned to prove, even if only to myself, that I was enough. I would show them. Somehow, some way, I would show the world that I wasn't the useless girl they thought I was. It wasn't until years later that I learned the truth about why they left me there. The orphanage director, a kind but overworked woman named Mrs. Patel, had pulled me aside when I was about 10. She'd been there the day my parents dropped me off, and she'd always seemed to feel sorry for me in a way I didn't fully understand. "Danielle," she said gently, sitting me down in her small, cluttered office. "You're old enough now to know why your parents brought you here." Her voice was kind, but her words hit like a knife. Your parents. They came from a very traditional background. When your little brother was born, they believed it was their duty to focus all their attention and resources on him, as the family's heir. I stared at her, the words sinking in like stones. "But I'm their daughter," I said, my voice trembling. "Why didn't they want me too?" Mrs. Patel sighed, her eyes filled with sympathy. "It's not about what you did or didn't do, Danielle. It's about them and their beliefs. It's wrong, so very wrong. But they thought they were doing what was expected of them." That night, as I lay in bed, the reality of their rejection hit me in full force. They hadn't left me because of anything I did. They left me because of who I was, a girl who to them wasn't worth keeping. After that conversation, something in me shifted. I stopped asking why they left and started focusing on what I could do to move forward. The rejection that once crushed me became my fuel. At school, I threw myself into every subject, determined to be the best. I stayed late to read in the library, poring over books that stretched my imagination and taught me about a world far bigger than the orphanage. By the time I was 16, I was winning academic competitions and earning recognition from teachers who saw my potential. Danielle, one of them told me, you could go far. You just need the right opportunities. Those words planted a seed of hope in me. I started applying for scholarships with a single goal in mind: to get into a good university and prove to myself that I could rise above the circumstances I was born into. When the acceptance letter from a prestigious school came in the mail, I held it in my hands like it was a golden ticket. It wasn't just a chance to study, it was my way out. The orphanage threw a small party in my honor, and Mrs. Patel, who had always been my quiet supporter, hugged me tightly. "You've earned this, Danielle," she said. "Now go show the world what you can do." College was a whirlwind. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who believed in me, or at least respected what I brought to the table. My professors noticed my drive, and my peers were drawn to my focus and determination. I took every opportunity that came my way: internships, leadership roles, and study groups that pushed me to the limit. Law school followed, and while it was grueling, I thrived on the challenge. I learned to channel my emotions into my work, using my own story to connect with the cases I studied. I knew what it was like to feel powerless, and I wanted to make sure others didn't have to feel the same. By the time I graduated, I had offers from some of the best firms in the country. I chose a firm in New York that specialized in helping underserved communities, a place where I could make a difference while building my career. Through it all, I kept my past a secret. It wasn't out of shame. I had nothing to be ashamed of, but because I wanted people to see me for who I was now, not the girl who had been left behind. Every step I took felt like a victory, a reminder that I had become someone my younger self could be proud of. It was during my second year at the firm that I met Mark. He was one of the attorneys on a joint case we worked, a complicated mess involving housing rights. At first, he was just another name in a sea of professionals, but as the weeks went on, I couldn't help but notice his warmth and sharp sense of humor. He had a way of making even the most stressful days feel a little lighter. Our relationship started slowly, almost unintentionally. Late nights at the office turned into shared dinners, and casual conversations about work became deeper talks about life. I was hesitant at first. I'd spent so long building walls to protect myself that letting someone in felt risky. But Mark was patient, never pushing me to share more than I was ready to. One night after we'd won the case, he walked me home. "You know," he said as we stood by my apartment door, "I think you're the most driven person I've ever met, but sometimes it's okay to let someone else carry a little of that weight." His words stayed with me long after he left, and for the first time in years, I felt like maybe I didn't have to do everything alone. As things between Mark and me grew more serious, we started talking about the future, what we wanted in life, where we saw ourselves in 5 or 10 years. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine having a family, something I had avoided thinking about for so long. Mark wanted kids, and so did I, though the thought scared me. I didn't want to repeat the mistakes my parents had made, but with him, it felt possible. It didn't take long for us to realize that building the life we dreamed of would require more than just hard work. Between student loans, rent, and the cost of living in New York, our combined incomes were stretched thin. We both worked long hours, but the idea of starting a family someday made the financial gap seem even larger. Mark was supportive, always reminding me that we were a team. "We'll figure it out together," he said one night as we pored over budgets and savings plans at the kitchen table. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to do more, to push myself even harder to ensure our future was secure. I loved my work at the firm, helping people who felt powerless, using the law to stand up for those who couldn't fight for themselves. It gave me purpose. But the truth was, it didn't pay much. Mark and I weren't struggling, but we weren't building the kind of financial security we needed to start a family either. And as much as I cared about my clients and the mission of the firm, I knew I couldn't ignore the practical side of things forever. One evening, as I reviewed my growing list of cases, I realized something had to change. It wasn't an easy decision. I'd spent years carving out a place for myself in the world of public interest law. But the more I thought about it, the more I knew it was time to move on. I needed to think about the future, not just mine, but ours. Over dinner that night, I told Mark what was on my mind. "I've been thinking," I said, swirling my fork in my pasta, "about applying to some bigger firms. Corporate law, maybe." He looked at me with a mix of surprise and concern. "Are you sure? I know how much you love what you're doing now." "I do," I admitted, "but it's not enough. If we want to start a family someday, we need to plan for it. I want to give our kids the kind of stability I didn't have growing up." He reached across the table, taking my hand in his. "If it's what you want, I'm with you," he said simply. "I know you'll succeed anywhere." As I updated my resume and started researching bigger firms, another thought began creeping into my mind, one I'd spent years pushing away. My family, the people who had abandoned me. I'd told myself I didn't need them, that I was better off without them in my life. But now, with the prospect of starting my own family, I found myself wondering, who were they? What kind of life did they build without me? I didn't know much about them, just fragments of stories I'd pieced together over the years. Mrs. Patel had once mentioned that they were wealthy, part of a prominent community. That fact had always stung. They hadn't left me because they couldn't afford to raise me. They left me because they didn't want me. The bitterness was hard to shake, but curiosity had started to outweigh the pain. I needed to know more. The next day, I called the orphanage. Mrs. Patel had retired years ago, but the new director, a woman named Claire, was kind and eager to help. "We still have some of your records," she said. "Why don't you come by? Maybe we can talk about what you're looking for." I agreed, my stomach tightening as I hung up the phone. I wasn't sure what I'd find, but I knew I had to take the first step. A few days later, I found myself walking through the familiar gates of the orphanage. It had been years since I'd last been there, but the sight of the weathered brick walls and the faint sound of children playing in the distance brought back a flood of memories. Claire, the director, greeted me warmly, her kind smile putting me at ease. "Come on in, Danielle," she said, leading me to her office. I pulled some files I thought might be helpful. We sat down, and she placed a thin folder on the desk between us. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, scanning through the pages of handwritten notes and forms from when I was first admitted. "Your parents," Claire began gently. "They came from a very well-off family. From what I can gather, they owned several businesses and had a prominent position in their community." She paused, gauging my reaction. "They didn't leave you because of financial hardship." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was still a blow. "Do you have anything else about them?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Claire hesitated before sliding a photocopy of a newspaper article across the desk. It was a feature on the Nguyen family, a story about their success, their growing company, and their perfect, polished life. There was a photo of them, my parents, older now but unmistakable, standing proudly next to a young man I knew had to be my brother. They looked so complete, so whole, like I'd never existed. After leaving the orphanage that day, I felt like I'd been split in two. One part of me was desperate for answers, while the other screamed to let it go. What good would it do to dig up the past? They'd made their choice, and I'd made mine. I had worked too hard to let their rejection define me any longer. I shoved the folder of information into a drawer at home and decided to focus on my future instead. A few weeks later, my efforts paid off. I received an offer from a top corporate law firm, exactly the kind of job that could provide the stability I needed to start the life Mark and I had been dreaming of. The pay was incredible, and the opportunity to work on high-profile cases was everything I'd hoped for. When I told Mark, his face lit up with pride. "I knew you'd get it," he said, pulling me into a hug. "You deserve this, Danielle." I threw myself into the new role, determined to prove myself all over again. The work was challenging, but I thrived on the pressure. Long hours in the office left little time to dwell on my family or the questions I'd left unanswered. For a while, it seemed like I'd made the right choice, leaving the past where it belonged. A couple of years passed. and life changed in ways I hadn't imagined. Mark and I welcomed our daughter, Mia, into the world, a tiny, perfect bundle of joy who turned our lives upside down in the best possible way. Becoming a mother brought out a side of me I didn't know I had. I wanted to give Mia everything I hadn't had growing up: unconditional love, security, and the unwavering knowledge that she was wanted. At the same time, my career was flourishing. I had become one of the youngest senior attorneys at the firm, handling major clients and earning a reputation for my precision and drive. The long hours were still there, but with Mia waiting for me at home, I found a new balance. Mark was my rock, stepping in whenever I needed to stay late or prepare for a big case. We were building the life we'd dreamed of, one built on mutual respect and love. And yet, every so often, in the quiet moments when I'd rock Mia to sleep, a shadow of the past would creep in. I'd think about the choices my parents made, about how they'd left me behind without a second thought. Holding Mia in my arms, I couldn't fathom how anyone could do that to their child. I pushed the thoughts away, telling myself it didn't matter. I had my family now, the one I'd chosen, the one that mattered. One morning, I walked into my office, coffee in hand, ready to dive into another packed day of meetings and case prep. My assistant knocked lightly on the door just as I was sitting down. "Danielle," she said with a bright smile, "Mr. Roberts wants to see you in his office. He said it's about a new client." I set my coffee down and straightened my blazer, curiosity piqued. New clients were always an exciting challenge, and I prided myself on being the firm's go-to for high-stakes cases. As I stepped into Mr. Roberts' office, he looked up from a stack of papers and gestured for me to sit. "Good morning, Danielle," he began, leaning back in his chair. "We've taken on a significant new client. It's a bit of a complicated case. Financial mismanagement, lawsuits, potential bankruptcy, high profile but discreet. And I think you're the right person for the job." He slid a file across the desk toward me. "This one's all yours." I picked up the folder and flipped it open, scanning the top page. The name at the top made my heart stop. Nguyen Holdings, my parents' business. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the familiar name, the memories of the orphanage and that faded newspaper article rushing back all at once. I looked up at Mr. Roberts, struggling to keep my face neutral. "Thank you," I said evenly. "I'll get started right away." I walked back to my office in a daze, clutching the folder like it might vanish if I let it go. My mind raced, a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't quite pin down. Anger, confusion, curiosity. They all swirled together, leaving me breathless. I closed the door behind me and sat down at my desk, staring at the name on the file. Nguyen Holdings, my parents' company. For a long time, I didn't move. I just sat there, torn between the instinct to shove the file into a drawer and forget it existed, or to dive into every detail and see how far they'd fallen. What were the odds that after all these years they'd end up in my office needing my help? The bitter irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my whole life trying to forget them, and now they were here, on paper at least, intruding on the life I'd built for myself. After a moment of hesitation, I opened the folder. If I was going to handle this case, or decide not to, I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. The first few pages outlined the basic facts. Nguyen Holdings was teetering on the brink of bankruptcy, entangled in multiple lawsuits from creditors, partners, and even former employees. It was a financial disaster, the kind that screamed of neglect and mismanagement. As I delved deeper into the documents, one name kept appearing: Bao Nguyen, my brother, the special one, the golden child they'd chosen over me. Apparently, he'd been handed the reins of the company a few years ago and had driven it straight into the ground. Misguided investments, failure to adapt to market trends, and reckless spending had left the business in shambles. Every page I read felt like a punch to the gut. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a shaky breath. It was almost poetic, really. The family that had thrown me away to prioritize their son now sat on the edge of ruin because of him. And here I was, their last hope, the one person who could potentially save them. The irony was as sharp as a blade, cutting through the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. That evening, I walked through the door, still holding the folder like it might slip through my fingers. Mark was in the kitchen, bouncing Mia on his hip while stirring a pot on the stove. The smell of dinner should have been comforting, but I felt too unsettled to notice. "You're home early," he said with a warm smile, glancing at me. "Everything okay?" I hesitated, placing the folder on the counter. "Not really," I admitted. "There's something big I need to tell you." He immediately set Mia down in her playpen and turned to face me, concern etched on his face. "What's going on?" I took a deep breath and told him everything: the new client, the name on the file, and the history I'd spent so many years trying to leave behind. As I spoke, his expression shifted from surprise to disbelief and finally to understanding. "So, let me get this straight," he said, his voice calm but deliberate. "The family who abandoned you is now sitting in financial ruin, and their survival depends on you?" "Pretty much," I said, crossing my arms and leaning against the counter. "It's surreal, isn't it?" Mark shook his head, his brow furrowed. "What are you going to do? Are you even considering taking the case?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I don't know yet," I admitted, "but I can't just ignore it. I think I need to meet with them, see what they're like now. Maybe it'll help me figure out what to do." Mark nodded slowly, leaning against the counter across from me. "That's fair. You've always been the kind of person who faces things head-on. Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" I asked, meeting his steady gaze. "Do what's best for you," he said. "Not for them, not for anyone else. You don't owe them anything, Danielle. If you decide to take this case, it has to be on your terms." His words hit me hard, but I nodded. "I'll keep that in mind," I said quietly. "The meeting's tomorrow. After that, I'll decide." Mark walked over and pulled me into a hug, his arms a steady anchor against the storm of emotions swirling inside me. "No matter what you choose," he murmured, "I've got your back." The next morning, I sat at my desk, staring at the phone for what felt like an eternity. My assistant had already reached out to Nguyen Holdings to arrange the meeting, and they'd agreed almost immediately. Now all that was left was to confirm the time. I took a deep breath, picked up the receiver, and dialed. A woman's voice answered on the other end. "Nguyen Holdings, how may I direct your call?" "This is Danielle from Cross & Roberts," I said, keeping my tone professional. "I'd like to confirm the meeting scheduled for tomorrow with Mr. Nguyen." "Of course," she replied cheerfully. "Mr. Nguyen and Mr. Bao Nguyen will be there at 11 a.m. Does that work for you?" My grip on the phone tightened at the mention of Bao's name. "Yes, that works perfectly," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Thank you." As I hung up, my stomach churned. The meeting was set. In less than 24 hours, I'd be sitting face to face with the family who'd left me behind. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. No matter how this meeting went, I knew one thing. I was ready to face them. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, staring at the ceiling as my mind raced with every possible scenario. What would I say? How would they react? Would they even recognize me? Every time I closed my eyes, their faces from that newspaper article flashed in my mind. Older, but unmistakable. By the time my alarm went off, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. The next morning, I got ready with a focus that was almost robotic, carefully selecting a sleek black suit and pulling my hair into a neat bun. I wanted to project confidence, even if I felt anything but. As I walked into the conference room at 10:50 a.m., I gave myself one last mental pep talk. "You've faced tougher challenges, Danielle. You can do this." At exactly 11 a.m., the door opened and they walked in. My father was first, looking every bit as proud and authoritative as I remembered. Behind him was Bao, his features sharper than in the photos but still carrying that same air of privilege. Neither of them gave me a second glance as they approached the table. "Ms. Danielle, thank you for meeting with us," my father said, extending his hand. His voice was polite, professional, and utterly devoid of recognition. I shook his hand firmly, my own composure flawless. "Of course," I replied evenly. "Please, have a seat." As they settled into their seats, I opened the folder in front of me, flipping through the pages with deliberate calm. "Let's get right to it," I said, my tone sharp and professional. "From what I've reviewed so far, Nguyen Holdings is in a precarious financial situation. Years of mismanagement, reckless investments, and mounting lawsuits have left the company on the brink of bankruptcy." I just couldn't resist. My father stiffened, his face flushed, and I could see the pride and anger building behind his composed exterior. Finally, he snapped. "Who do you think you are, questioning me like that?" he barked, his voice echoing through the room. For a moment, I just stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. He had no idea. No idea who I was. No idea that the person sitting across from him was the same little girl he deemed unworthy all those years ago. And now I'm here, sitting across from the man who left me behind, demanding my help. Part of me wants to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Another part of me wants to scream. He doesn't even recognize me. He doesn't see the person I've become, the person who's now in control of what happens next. So I'm asking you, what would you do if you were me? Would you confront him here and now, rip off the mask and force him to see the truth? See who the person he abandoned has become? Would you take the case and show him that I'm stronger than he ever gave me credit for? Or would you walk away, leaving him to deal with the mess he and his golden child created? And then there's another thought that keeps creeping in. Should I ruin their lives for good? Should I let their empire crumble and watch them feel the pain they once made me endure? Is that justice? Is that revenge? I don't know anymore. All I know is that whatever I decide will change everything. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'm still deciding, and maybe your perspective will help me figure out how this story ends. Hey there! Did you like the story? If you did, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot and makes sure you won't miss out on more great stories we share here. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.
Layla gripped the steering wheel tightly, her breath catching as the officer's voice rang out through her car window. "Step out of the vehicle," he demanded, his tone as sharp as the glare of the patrol car's flashing lights behind her. Her heart pounded against her chest. How could she explain that she physically couldn't comply? The air inside the car felt suffocating as panic started to take hold. The day had started so peacefully, with Layla savoring her morning coffee and a quiet sense of accomplishment as she prepared for a simple meetup with friends. Driving had become a symbol of her independence, a victory over the accident that had changed her life forever. But now, parked on the side of the road, her sanctuary was under siege. The officer's towering presence outside her window shattered her sense of safety. This wasn't just a routine stop, it was a confrontation with assumptions, power, and prejudice. As the officer leaned closer, his words cutting like a blade, Layla's resolve stiffened. She wasn't just a disabled woman trapped in a car, she was a fighter who had rebuilt her life brick by brick. What happened next, however, would leave both of them, and everyone watching, forever changed. Welcome to Real Life Stories New, where narratives like these challenge your perspective and uncover the resilience of the human spirit. Watch as Layla's courage takes center stage in a battle that is far more than a traffic stop. Will she rise against the odds, or will this day rewrite her journey forever? Layla's hands trembled on the steering wheel, her mind racing as the officer's voice echoed in her ears. "Step out of the vehicle," he repeated, his tone cold and unyielding. She glanced at her prosthetic legs, an unspoken reminder of her reality, and took a steadying breath. This wasn't just fear. It was humiliation, bubbling beneath the surface and threatening to spill over. "Officer, I physically can't step out," she said, her voice calm but firm. Her stomach tightened as she searched his face for any sign of understanding, but his expression remained stony. Instead, he leaned closer, his shadow darkening the interior of her car. "I said get out," he barked, his hand brushing the edge of the door handle. Layla's chest tightened. She felt cornered, every inch of her autonomy slipping away under his oppressive gaze. The vulnerability she fought so hard to conceal was now laid bare. Would this man even care if she told him about the years of grit and resilience it took to regain her independence? "I can't comply with your orders," she repeated, her voice shaking now but resolute. "I don't have the ability to stand." Her words hung in the air, fragile yet defiant. For a moment, she thought she saw hesitation flicker in his eyes, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. Without another word, he yanked the door open, the sound of the latch releasing like a gunshot in her ears. Before she could process what was happening, his hand clamped around her arm, and he began pulling her forward. "Let me go!" Layla cried, her voice breaking as panic set in. Her prosthetics shifted awkwardly, one twisting out of place, the metal frame clattering against the pavement. The sound was deafening, a cruel reminder of her reality. Around them, murmurs began to ripple through a growing crowd. "She can't even walk," someone shouted, their voice cutting through the tense atmosphere. Layla's breath hitched as she caught sight of people raising their phones, cameras trained on the unfolding scene. It was no longer just her fight. Strangers now bore witness to her struggle, and their presence brought a glimmer of hope amidst the chaos. The officer's grip tightened, his frustration boiling over. "You think you're above the law?" he hissed, his voice dripping with disdain. "I don't care what excuses you have. Get out now, or I'll assist you further." Her mind raced. She could either give in, let herself be dragged completely into his control, or she could resist, not physically, but through the only weapon she had left, her voice. "I told you, I can't," she shouted, her desperation echoing louder now. The sting of tears blurred her vision, but she refused to break. "What you're doing is wrong. And you will be held accountable." His hand hovered near his holster, his posture taut and threatening. Layla's pulse quickened as the officer made his intentions clear. This wasn't just about compliance anymore, it was about dominance, about stripping her of her dignity. And then, just as the situation threatened to spiral further out of control, a new voice broke through the tension. "Step back." The younger officer's tone was commanding, yet measured. Derek, she thought his name was. He moved toward them, his tall frame intercepting the escalating scene. "You're escalating a situation that doesn't need to be. Let her go." The first officer turned sharply, his face twisting with indignation. "This is none of your business," he spat. "She's resisting, and I'm handling it." "She's not resisting," Derek countered, his voice calm but firm. He gestured toward the crowd. "And you're not just handling this anymore. The whole world is watching." The tension between the two men crackled like electricity. Layla could only watch, her breaths shallow, as Derek subtly positioned himself closer to her, his body language protective. "You need to step down, now," Derek said, his tone leaving no room for argument. For the first time, the first officer faltered, his eyes darting toward the phones held aloft by the crowd. His face hardened as he turned his glare back toward Layla. "This isn't over," he muttered, venom dripping from his words. But he released her arm, stepping away as Derek stood his ground. Layla's entire body felt like it was vibrating with adrenaline. She didn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified. As Derek turned to her, his expression softened, though there was a quiet fire in his eyes. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low, almost gentle. Layla swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. "I'm not hurt," she said, her voice trembling, "but I'm not okay with what just happened." Derek nodded, his jaw tightening. "And you shouldn't be. None of this was right." Around them, the crowd murmured in support, their voices blending into a wave of solidarity. For the first time since the ordeal began, Layla felt a flicker of something she hadn't expected: hope. As sirens blared in the distance, signaling the arrival of more officers, she looked Derek in the eyes and said with quiet determination, "This isn't just about me. This has to stop." "I know," he replied, his gaze steady. "And I'm going to help make sure it does." For the first time, Layla felt like she wasn't fighting alone. Layla stood outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the pavement. She glanced at the crowd gathered around her, their cheers and signs a stark contrast to the tension that had gripped her only hours ago. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of closure, not because everything was resolved, but because she had faced her fears and spoken her truth. Inside the courtroom, she had found her voice. It wasn't just about her story but about the broader fight for dignity and justice. The moment she looked into the eyes of those who came to support her, Derek, Vanessa, strangers who believed in her cause, she realized she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was standing tall, even if not on her own legs, and that made all the difference. Layla took a deep breath, her prosthetic legs steady beneath her as she wheeled herself through the sea of supporters. Her determination had grown into something greater, a commitment to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. She was no longer just a victim, she was a symbol of resilience, a voice for change. As the crowd began to disperse, a young girl in a wheelchair rolled up to Layla. "You're so brave," she said softly, her eyes wide with admiration. Layla smiled, her heart swelling. "And so are you," she replied, reaching out to take the girl's hand. Moments like this reminded her why the fight mattered. It wasn't just for justice but for hope, for a world where no one felt invisible or powerless. If this story moved you, please like, share, and help Real Life Stories New reach 10,000 subscribers. Together, we can shine a light on stories that inspire and change lives.
My wife cheated, and my own mom defended her. So I cut them off and walked away. I'm 49 now, and looking back, everything kind of started falling apart about 10 years ago. At the time, I was married to my wife Karen, and we had 2 kids. My daughter Sarah, who was 12, and my son Mike, who was 9. We were living in Texas, where we had a pretty decent life. We even had a small family business that we ran for years, but then the economy tanked, and well, everything went downhill from there. See, back then, there was this huge financial mess called the Great Recession. It was everywhere on the news, and people were losing their jobs, houses, everything. Our business didn't survive either, and honestly, I felt like I was sinking. I was trying to keep things together, but no matter what I did, it seemed like I couldn't catch a break. Our savings were getting eaten up, and there were times when I didn't know how we were going to pay the bills. I remember feeling the pressure on my shoulders every single day, and I knew I had to do something different if we were going to make it. So when I got offered a job overseas in Dubai, I jumped at it. It wasn't an easy decision. In fact, it was probably the hardest one I ever made. But it was a big opportunity, and we needed the money. I remember sitting down with Karen and telling her about the offer. I told her it was the only way to get us back on our feet, and she seemed to understand. But there was this look in her eyes, like she wasn't entirely convinced. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I figured she was just worried about the move and being apart. Anyway, I packed my bags and headed to Dubai, promising Karen and the kids that I'd visit home every 6 months. The plan was to set up shop there, earn enough money, and eventually move back once things were more stable. I wasn't happy about leaving, but I kept telling myself that it was for them, that I was doing the right thing. You know, trying to be the good husband and dad, taking care of the family, all that. The first few months were tough. Dubai was a whole new world, different culture, different everything. But I threw myself into the work. I worked long hours, built connections, and slowly, things started picking up. It was lonely, though. I mean, it's one thing to be busy all day, but coming home to an empty apartment night after night gets to you. I missed my family like crazy, and the only thing that kept me going was the thought that one day I'd be back home with them. I kept my promise and flew back every 6 months. I tried to squeeze in as much time with the kids and Karen as I could, but it wasn't the same. Sarah and Mike were growing up, and I felt like I was missing out on their lives. Karen, well, she seemed distant. At first, I thought it was just because she was stressed from handling everything alone, managing the house, the kids, and everything else. I mean, it's a lot for one person. So I didn't push her on it. I figured she needed time to adjust, just like I did. But every time I came back, it felt like there was this wall between us. I'd suggest that maybe they could move to Dubai with me, now that things were going well and I had a place set up. But Karen wasn't interested. She kept saying the kids were doing well in school, and that she didn't want to pull them away from their friends. I got it. Nobody wants to uproot their kids. But a part of me wondered if there was more to it. Still, I let it slide. I didn't want to cause any more stress, especially with everything we'd already been through. When the kids finally finished high school and started college in Houston, I brought it up again. I figured it was the perfect time for Karen to join me. The kids were grown and they had their own lives now, so why not? But again, she shot down the idea. This time, she said she didn't want to leave her mom alone, that it would be too much for her to handle. I suggested that we could bring her mom with us to Dubai, make it a fresh start for all of us, but she just wasn't interested. At this point, I started to feel something wasn't right. I mean, I'd done everything I could. I built a life for us out there, and I was ready to have my family back, but she seemed like she didn't want to be with me at all. I kept trying to convince myself that she just needed more time, that maybe she was scared of the change, but deep down, it didn't sit well. I remember the last visit I made before everything started to really go south. I had this big plan, this idea that I was going to shut down the business in Dubai and move back to Texas for good. I thought it was the answer to all our problems. I mean, if the issue was distance, then the solution was simple, right? Just close up shop, head home, and everything would be fine. I thought she'd be happy, relieved even. But when I told her, she didn't react the way I expected. She seemed irritated, almost like she was annoyed with me. She said, "Why would you do that? You've worked so hard to set everything up there, and now you just want to throw it all away?" I was confused. I thought she'd be excited for me to come back, for us to finally be together as a family again. But instead, it felt like she didn't even want me there. That's when I started feeling this knot in my stomach, like maybe I was missing something. It wasn't just her reaction that threw me off. A day later, my mom called me up telling me the exact same thing, telling me not to rush back and that I was making a mistake by closing the business. Now, I hadn't mentioned my plans to anyone but Karen, so I knew she must have talked to my mom about it. I tried not to read into it too much, but it felt like they were plotting something together. It made me doubt my decision and everything else. Maybe I was being paranoid, or maybe I was just looking for answers that weren't there. After that, I decided to drop the idea of moving back, at least for a while. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I'd go days without calling, just to see if Karen would reach out, but she didn't. Our conversations became quick and to the point, almost like we were just checking off a box. I'd ask about the kids, she'd tell me they were fine, and that was it. It felt like we were strangers living separate lives. I tried bringing it up a few times, asking if she was happy or if she felt like something was wrong between us, but she'd always brush it off. She'd say I was overthinking and that everything was fine, but it didn't feel fine. I kept telling myself I was just stressed out from work, that the distance was messing with my head, but deep down, I knew something was changing. And the worst part was, I didn't know how to fix it. So, after that last visit, things really started to change between Karen and me. It's like all those small doubts I had were suddenly getting bigger, and I couldn't ignore them anymore. I mean, I'd come back home expecting things to feel normal, but they didn't. It felt like I was some stranger dropping by instead of a husband coming home to his wife. Every time I left, I'd hope that the next trip would be different, but it never was. Karen and I started talking less and less. It was weird, and honestly, a bit painful. I'd send a text, and sometimes it'd take her hours, even days, to respond. When we did talk, it was all just surface-level stuff. She'd tell me about how the kids were doing, or how her mom was, but she never really talked about herself. And when I asked, she'd just brush it off like her life didn't matter. "Everything's fine," she'd say. But it didn't feel fine. It felt like she was keeping me at arm's length, and I didn't know why. I started testing things. I'd go a whole day without messaging her, just to see if she'd notice or ask what was going on. But most of the time, she didn't even seem to care. Days turned into weeks where our communication was barely anything beyond a quick, "How's it going?" or "Kids are fine." I could feel the distance between us getting wider, but every time I tried to bring it up, she'd just tell me I was being paranoid. She'd say I was overthinking everything and that we were fine, but I didn't believe it. One time, I asked her straight up if she still wanted to be with me. It was one of those late night calls when you just can't hold it in anymore. I was tired of pretending everything was okay when it clearly wasn't. But instead of reassuring me, she got defensive. She said, "Why would you even ask that? Of course, I want to be with you." But the way she said it felt like she was trying to convince herself more than me. Then there was this one weird thing that really got to me. Karen started becoming super protective of her phone. Now, before, she was never like that. She'd leave her phone lying around, and it was no big deal. But lately, she wouldn't even let it out of her sight. Even when we were on video calls, if her phone went off, she'd make some excuse and turn off the camera or say she had to go. I didn't know what to make of it, but I couldn't help but feel like she was hiding something. There was this one time when I came back for a short visit. I was only home for a week, and I noticed she'd always keep her phone face down or take it with her even if she just left the room for a minute. It was little stuff, but it added up. I tried to play it off, thinking maybe she was just being more careful, but it didn't sit right with me. When I asked her why she was acting weird with her phone, she just laughed it off, saying I was being paranoid again. "You've been gone so long you're starting to imagine things," she joked. But it didn't feel like a joke. After that, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was going on. It's not like I wanted to think that way about her. I'd trusted Karen for years, and we'd been through a lot together. But everything was adding up, and it was hard to ignore. I mean, we'd spent over a decade married, and I thought I knew her better than anyone. But now, I wasn't so sure. What really got to me was how distant she was becoming. Not just emotionally, but physically. I tried to get close to her during that visit, hug her, kiss her, but she felt cold. Like she'd go through the motions, but it was like she was holding back. At one point, I even asked her if something was wrong, but she just shrugged me off. "I'm just stressed," she said. "There's a lot going on with the kids, and your mom's not doing great." She always had an excuse. It felt like she was putting up walls, and no matter how hard I tried to break them down, she wouldn't let me in. It made me start questioning everything. Was it me? Was it the distance? Or was there something else going on? Around that same time, my mom started acting weird too. She'd call me up out of nowhere, asking how things were going and giving me advice I didn't ask for. She told me I needed to focus on my business in Dubai and not worry so much about what was happening back home. Now, I love my mom, but it felt like she was reading from Karen's script. It was almost like they were in on something together. I know that sounds paranoid, but when your gut's telling you something's off, it's hard to ignore. One night, after a long day of work in Dubai, I was sitting alone in my apartment, thinking about everything. I was feeling really torn. On one hand, I wanted to believe that Karen and my mom were just worried about me and trying to help. On the other, it felt like they were pushing me away, and I didn't know why. I even started to wonder if Karen had found someone else. I mean, why else would she act so distant? But then I'd feel guilty for thinking that way. She was my wife. If I couldn't trust her, then who could I trust? Still, the doubt was eating at me. I started paying more attention to everything she said, every little detail, trying to find clues that would prove or disprove what I was feeling. But she was careful. Too careful, if you ask me. And every time I brought up my concerns, she'd just brush them off or change the subject. There was this one moment that really stuck with me. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone while she was in the kitchen. Her phone buzzed and she picked it up right away. But instead of reading the message, she looked up at me. It was like she was checking to see if I noticed. When she realized I was watching, she quickly put her phone away and went back to cooking. I remember feeling this knot in my stomach like something wasn't right. I asked her later who it was, and she just said it was her mom, but the way she avoided my eyes when she said it made me feel like she was lying. The distance between us kept growing. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was the one messing things up by being so far away. But then I'd remind myself that I was out here for them, for Karen and the kids. It wasn't like I wanted to be gone. I was just trying to do the best I could to provide for them. But none of that seemed to matter anymore. I started feeling isolated, like I was stuck in some kind of limbo, where I couldn't go back, but couldn't move forward either. Every time I thought about packing up and moving back to Texas, I'd hear Karen's voice in my head, telling me I was being too hasty. I'd think about my mom's warnings, and I'd second-guess myself all over again. It was like I was trapped, not knowing what the right move was. In the end, I decided to stay put in Dubai for a while longer, trying to keep my mind focused on work. But even then, it was like my heart wasn't in it anymore. I'd get up, go through the motions, and come home to an empty apartment every night. And all the while, the doubt kept growing, clawing at the back of my mind, making me wonder if I was missing something right in front of me. I reached a point where I couldn't take it anymore. The doubt, the distance, and the constant feeling that something was wrong, it all got to me. Every day I felt like I was walking around with a weight on my shoulders, and the more I tried to push it away, the heavier it got. I knew something was going on, and no matter how much I tried to convince myself that it was just in my head, it didn't feel like that. So I made a decision. I was going to find out what was happening, one way or another. I booked a ticket home, but didn't tell anyone. Not Karen, not my mom, not even the kids. I figured if I was wrong, then great, but if I was right, at least I'd know for sure. And honestly, the not knowing was worse than anything else. When I landed in Texas, I was anxious. My mind was racing, and I kept thinking about all the possibilities, everything I might find. I got to the house early in the morning, using the spare key to let myself in. The place was quiet, and for a second I thought maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe Karen had just been tired or stressed, and I'd been blowing things out of proportion. But then, as I walked through the house, I noticed small things that felt off. There were things out of place, like Karen's clothes folded neatly on the couch instead of in the bedroom, and her phone charger left plugged into the kitchen wall when she always kept it by the bed. It was small stuff, but enough to make my nerves spike. I kept telling myself to calm down, but every step I took felt like I was getting closer to something I wasn't ready to face. Then I heard footsteps coming from the kitchen. I turned the corner and saw Karen standing there, looking completely shocked to see me. Her reaction was everything I needed to know. She froze for a moment, and then she forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, you're home early," she said, trying to play it off like she was happy to see me. But I could tell she wasn't. I kept it casual. I told her I had a light workload for the month and thought it'd be a nice surprise to come home and spend some time together. She went along with it, but the whole time, I could see how tense she was. She was asking questions, almost too many, about why I didn't tell her I was coming and how long I planned to stay. It was like she was trying to figure out how much time she had to prepare or hide something. I shrugged it off, but inside I knew she was hiding something. Over the next couple of days, I paid close attention to everything. I tried to act normal, like I wasn't suspicious, but I watched every move she made. I noticed she was still being weird with her phone, always keeping it close, always checking it when she thought I wasn't looking. It was almost like she was waiting for a message or trying to hide who she was talking to. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know what was going on, so I did something I never thought I'd do. I started snooping. When she was asleep or in the shower, I'd check her phone, but she had it locked up tight. No messages, no missed calls. Nothing out of the ordinary. It was like she had wiped everything clean. I felt like an idiot, but it just made me more determined to get to the bottom of it. One night, while she was out running errands, I decided to take things a step further. I put a GPS tracker in her car. I know, it's extreme, and it's not something I'm proud of, but I needed answers. I couldn't live with the constant doubt anymore, and if she was up to something, I wanted to know for sure. The first couple of times I tracked her, everything seemed normal. She'd go to the grocery store, visit her mom's place, or pick up some stuff from the pharmacy. But then, one day I saw her go to this small hardware store across town. It was a place I'd never heard her mention before, and I'd never seen her go there during my visits. I waited, thinking maybe she was just grabbing some supplies or whatever, but she stayed there for a long time. I drove over, parked a few blocks away, and watched from a distance. The place looked closed, lights off and everything, but Karen's car was parked out front. After a while, the store owner came out and looked around, almost like he was checking if anyone was watching. Then he pulled down the shutters with Karen still inside. My heart sank. I knew right then that I was onto something, but I needed more proof. I followed her again a few days later. Same routine. She went to the hardware store, and the owner shut the place down as soon as she walked in. This time I stayed longer, waiting to see if anything would happen. I felt this anger bubbling up inside me, but I had to keep my cool. If I went in guns blazing without any solid proof, she'd just lie or come up with some excuse. A couple of days later, I decided to test the waters. I casually asked Karen about the store, pretending like I saw it while driving past. She hesitated for a second, but then said she was helping out with some home improvement project for her mom. She said it so smoothly I almost believed her, but something in her eyes gave her away. It was like she was waiting to see if I'd buy her story. I just nodded and played along, but I knew she was lying. The next time I tracked her, I parked even closer. I watched as she got out of her car and met the store owner outside. They talked for a bit, and then I saw him put his arm around her. It wasn't just a friendly gesture. The way he pulled her close, it was like they were more than friends. My blood was boiling. I wanted to confront them right then and there, but I forced myself to wait. After they went inside and he pulled the shutters down again, I got out of my car and walked up to the store. I knocked on the door a few times, but there was no answer. I could hear movement inside, like they were scrambling. It took everything in me not to kick the door down, but I knew I had to play this smart. If I blew my cover now, I'd never get the truth. I stepped back, took a deep breath, and walked away, feeling more conflicted than ever. Part of me wanted to keep digging, to find out everything, but another part of me didn't want to know. I didn't want to face the reality that Karen, the woman I'd trusted for so long, was betraying me. But I had to know the truth, even if it meant confronting my worst fears. Over the next few days, I kept a closer eye on her. She had this routine, going out in the afternoons, sometimes visiting her mom, other times running errands. Every time she left, I followed. It was exhausting, but I needed to catch her slipping up. I needed that one piece of undeniable proof. It was like waiting for a storm to hit. I knew something was coming, but I didn't know when or how bad it would be. I just had to be ready. After everything I'd seen and all the doubts swirling in my head, I knew I couldn't just sit back and watch anymore. It was eating me up inside. All those times I'd convinced myself to stay calm, to play it smart, felt like they were only giving Karen more chances to cover her tracks. I had to do something, and I had to do it soon. So I made a plan to catch her in the act, and this time, there was no turning back. I kept tracking her movements for the next few days, trying to find a pattern. She had this habit of going out in the afternoons, saying she was visiting her mom or running errands, but I knew better now. I just needed to be ready for the right moment. Then, one day, everything lined up. She left the house, and her car's tracker led me straight to that same hardware store. I parked my car a block away, far enough not to be noticed, but close enough to keep an eye on the place. My heart was pounding as I watched her pull up, get out, and walk toward the store. The guy came out to greet her, and they exchanged a quick look before heading inside. Just like before, he pulled the shutters down, closing up shop with Karen still in there. This was it. I knew this was my chance. I got out of the car and walked up to the store, my hands shaking with a mix of anger and adrenaline. When I reached the door, I knocked hard. At first, there was no response, just silence. I banged again, louder this time, and finally the guy opened the door a crack. He looked surprised to see me, like he wasn't expecting any visitors, let alone me. "Where's Karen?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but I could feel the rage boiling up inside me. The guy hesitated, his eyes shifting like he was looking for a way out. He didn't say anything, and that was all the confirmation I needed. I pushed the door open and walked in, not giving him a chance to stop me. The store was dimly lit, and most of the shelves were covered with tarps, like the place wasn't even in business. I moved quickly through the aisles, following the sounds coming from the back. My heart was racing, and every step felt heavier than the last. Then I found her. Karen was there, in the storeroom, in a position I wish I could unsee. She looked up, and the shock on her face was everything I needed to know. She'd been caught. The moment froze for a second, everything crashing down on me at once. All the suspicion, all the doubt, it all became real. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, but there it was, right in front of me. The guy, her so-called friend, or whatever he was, tried to step in between us, but I wasn't having it. I lunged at him, shoving him out of the way, and yelled at Karen, demanding to know how long this had been going on. She was scrambling, pulling herself together, and for a moment, she just stared at me, eyes wide, like a deer caught in headlights. She tried to say something, but her voice was shaky. The guy jumped back in, grabbing me by the arm, and things got heated real fast. We started shoving each other, and he tried to drag me out of the storeroom. Karen was yelling at both of us to stop, but everything felt like it was moving in slow motion. I managed to push him off and got one good punch in, knocking him back. I could feel the anger and betrayal driving every move I made. Karen finally stepped in between us, telling the guy to back off. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she begged me to leave, saying we could talk about this later at home. But I wasn't leaving without answers. "Why, Karen?" I demanded. "How long have you been doing this?" I could barely keep my voice steady. The anger was mixing with this awful, sinking feeling of betrayal, and I needed to know why. Karen stood there, wiping her eyes, and finally, she started to speak. It's not what you think, she said, but I wasn't having any of it. How long? I shouted again, and she flinched, finally admitting, It's been a few years, okay? But it doesn't mean anything. A few years. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. She was standing there, acting like it was no big deal, like this wasn't the complete destruction of our marriage. I couldn't even look at her. I felt my whole body go numb. A few years? I repeated, more to myself than to her. All this time, and you just kept lying to me? She tried to explain, saying something about how lonely she'd been and how hard it was with me gone for so long. She said she didn't want to hurt me, but she didn't know how to cope with the distance. It was excuse after excuse, and I just stood there, letting the words wash over me. None of it mattered. The fact was, she chose to betray me instead of being honest. I looked at the guy, and he had this smug look on his face, like he thought he'd gotten away with something. You need to leave, I told him, my voice barely above a growl. This is between me and my wife. He hesitated, and I stepped forward, making it clear I wasn't going to let him stay. Finally, he backed off, muttering something under his breath as he left the storeroom. Karen tried to reach for my hand, but I pulled away. Don't, I said. Just don't. She started crying again, pleading with me to go home with her so we could talk, but I wasn't in the mood for talking. I felt like my whole world had come crashing down, and there was no going back from this. She kept saying she was sorry, that it wasn't what I thought, but I didn't want to hear it. You had years to tell me the truth, I said. You had years to fix this, and instead you chose this guy over our marriage. She didn't know what to say. She just stood there, crying, while I felt everything I'd built with her slip away. All the trust, all the love. It felt like it had been torn to shreds in that moment. I told her I needed space, that I couldn't be around her right now. She tried to protest, but I was done listening. I walked out of that store, not looking back, and drove straight to my mom's house. My head was spinning, and all I could think about was how everything had fallen apart. I needed answers, and if Karen wasn't going to give them to me, then maybe my mom would. When I got to her place, I didn't waste any time. I walked in, and the first thing I said was, You knew, didn't you? My mom tried to act surprised, but I could see right through it. Don't lie to me, I told her. You knew about Karen's affair. She just sat there looking guilty, and that was all the confirmation I needed. She started to cry, saying she didn't want to tell me because she thought it would destroy everything. You think this doesn't hurt? I shot back. Keeping it from me, pretending everything was fine, how is that any better? My mom reached for my hand, telling me she was sorry, but I couldn't handle it. I pulled away, feeling like I'd been betrayed all over again, not just by Karen, but by my own family. I felt like I didn't know who I could trust anymore. I told her I needed to be alone, and before she could say anything else, I walked out. I needed space to process everything, to figure out what I was going to do next. My marriage was falling apart, and my family had lied to me. It felt like everything I thought I knew had been ripped away, and I didn't know where to go from there. After leaving my mom's place, I drove around for hours, not knowing where to go or what to do next. My head was a mess, and everything felt like it was spinning out of control. I mean, how was I supposed to process all of this? My wife had been cheating on me for years, and my own mother had known about it and said nothing. It was like every single thing I believed in had been flipped upside down. I ended up parking by a small park we used to take the kids to when they were little. I sat there, staring at nothing, feeling like I was stuck in some nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Part of me wanted to go back to the house, to confront Karen again, to scream and yell and demand why she had thrown away everything we'd built together. But another part of me felt drained, like I didn't have the energy for it anymore. I was just done. For the next couple of days, I stayed at a cheap motel. I didn't tell anyone where I was. I needed time to think, to figure out what my next move was going to be. Karen was blowing up my phone with calls and texts, begging me to come back so we could talk, but I ignored her. She had her chance to be honest, and she blew it. I wasn't ready to hear any more of her excuses. My mom tried reaching out too, leaving voicemails, saying she was worried about me and that she was sorry. But every time I listened to her voice, all I could think about was how she'd looked me in the eye and lied, pretending everything was fine when she knew the truth. I couldn't get past that. It felt like my own family had betrayed me, and I didn't know if I'd ever be able to forgive her for that. On the third day, I decided to pack my bags and head to Houston. My daughters were there, living on their own, and I needed to see them. They were grown now, but they deserved to know what was going on. I didn't want Karen getting to them first and twisting the story to make herself look like the victim. I'd seen enough of that already, and I wasn't going to let her manipulate our kids. When I got to Houston, I met up with them at a coffee shop. They were happy to see me at first, But then they saw the look on my face, and I could tell they knew something was wrong. We sat down and I told them everything, the affair, how long it had been going on, and how my mom had known the whole time. I watched their faces change as the reality of it hit them. My oldest daughter, Sarah, was angry. She said she always had this weird feeling about her mom, that sometimes things didn't add up. She even mentioned seeing Karen act a little too friendly with some guy when she'd visited home once, but she brushed it off, thinking it was nothing. Now, it all made sense to her. My younger one, Mike, was quieter. He seemed hurt and confused, like he didn't know how to process it all. I could tell he was trying to stay strong, but I could see the pain in his eyes. He'd always been closer to Karen, and I knew this was going to hit him harder. I felt awful seeing my kids go through this, knowing that the family they thought they had wasn't real. It felt like I'd failed them somehow, like I should have seen the signs sooner. Sarah said she was done with her mom. She didn't want to hear any excuses and told me she'd already blocked Karen's number. She was furious, and honestly, I didn't blame her. But Mike, he was more torn. He didn't want to cut off his mom, even after everything. I told him it was his choice. I wasn't going to force him to take sides, but I reminded him to be careful. I knew Karen, and I knew she'd try to twist things to get him on her side. After I talked to the kids, I drove back to the house. I figured it was time to face Karen again and deal with whatever came next. I needed to figure out where we were headed and what the future looked like now that everything was out in the open. When I walked in, Karen was waiting for me, sitting at the kitchen table. She looked like a mess, red eyes, tissues everywhere, but I wasn't feeling sorry for her. She got up when she saw me and tried to hug me, but I stepped back. "We need to talk," I said, and she nodded, sitting back down. We sat there for what felt like ages, just staring at each other. Finally, she started talking. She went on about how she felt lonely all those years I was away, how she was struggling, and how she made a mistake. She tried to make it sound like it was just some meaningless thing, like she was doing it to fill the void, but I wasn't buying it. "You had years to tell me the truth," I said. "Years, and instead you chose to lie." She kept apologizing, saying she never meant to hurt me, and that she didn't want to lose me, but the more she talked, the more I realized she was just scared of losing her comfortable life. It wasn't about me. It was about the security and the money. I could see right through her now, and all the trust I used to have in her was gone. I asked her how many people knew about the affair. She hesitated, and that told me everything. "My mom knew, right?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. She nodded, saying that my mom found out a few years back but promised not to say anything. "She said she didn't want to ruin the family," Karen added. It felt like a punch to the gut, hearing that excuse again. It was like they thought keeping me in the dark was doing me a favor. At that point, I was done. I got up, grabbed my things, and told her I was leaving. She tried to follow me, crying and begging me to stay, but I couldn't even look at her anymore. I told her I needed space and that I wasn't coming back until I figured out what I wanted to do next. I wasn't ready to talk about divorce or what would happen to the house. I just needed to get out of there. I drove back to the motel, feeling a mix of anger and relief. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had some control over my life again. I didn't know what the future was going to look like, but at least I was done pretending everything was okay when it clearly wasn't. I decided to cut off Karen financially. If she wanted to stay in that house, she'd have to figure it out herself. I wasn't going to keep supporting her while she lived off my hard work and betrayed me behind my back. I called my daughters and told them what I was planning. Sarah was all for it. She said Karen needed to face the consequences of her actions. Mike was quieter, and I could tell he was struggling with it. I told him that it was his decision if he wanted to help his mom, but that I wasn't going to be part of it anymore. He needed to know the truth and make his own choices. So that's where things stand now. I'm still at the motel, trying to figure out my next move. Part of me wants to pack up and go back to Dubai, to put as much distance between myself and this mess as possible. But another part of me knows that running away won't solve anything. I need to face it head on, but I'm not sure how yet. For now, I'm just taking things one day at a time, trying to process everything and figure out what's best for me and my kids. I'll keep updating when I can, but honestly, I don't know how this is going to play out. All I know is that I'm done being taken for a fool, and I'm done letting other people decide my life for me.